The man who once said that Linux was a cancer is watching Linux eat his empire alive. Let that sentence sit in the space between what the technology press reports as the quarterly earnings story and what the actual numbers document as the foundational erosion whose acceleration the specific convergence of the specific Microsoft decisions has produced as the present reality rather than the predicted scenario whose essus, the decades of the patient waiting whose end the current inflection point's data confirms as the statistical finding that no amount of corporate communication strategy can reframe as the manageable transition rather than the existential disruption whose E-scale Bill Gates, Steve Ballmer, and Satya Nadella, across the successive leadership chapters of the Microsoft story, each believed the Windows monopoly's structural depth would permanently prevent as the achievable competitor outcome. The competitor did not come from Apple. The competitor did not come from Google. The competitor came from the community whose existence the corporate model cannot replicate, cannot purchase, and cannot extinguish. Because the thing you cannot buy is the thing whose value the community's voluntary contribution establishes as the foundation that the acquisition's checkbook cannot reproduce as the equivalent replacement. The numbers that Microsoft does not want discussed in the same paragraph as the Windows revenue figure are the numbers that tell the story whose honest telling this examination delivers as the evidential account rather than the advocacy's enthusiastic projection. 1 billion. That is the number of Windows users Microsoft publicly celebrate. S as the installed base whose scale the platform's continued dominance supposedly confirms as the evidence that the Linux threat's characterization as the existential disruption overstates the competitive reality as the enthusiast's wishful exaggeration. But here is the number that belongs in the same sentence as the 1 billion, 240 million. That is the number of Windows 10 computers. Microsoft officially abandoned when the support termination deadline arrived as the corporate decision whose user impact the business calculation did not wait as the primary consideration. 240 million functional computers, 240 million users confronting the choice between the unnecessary hardware purchase, the paid security extension, the security, vulnerabilities acceptance, or the Linux installation that transforms the abandoned machine into the fully supported modern computing environment at the cost of exactly nothing. When you manufacture 240 million motivated Linux converts through a single policy decision, the shocked characterization of the reaction is not the dramatic overstatement. It is the accurate description of the consequence whose scale the decision's authors demonstrably failed to anticipate as the departure catalyst whose conversion rate the subsequent download statistics document as the real and accelerating outcome. Bill Gates built the personal computing era's foundation on the insight that the software, not the hardware, was the valuable layer whose control the dominant platform position delivers as the compounding advantage. The operating system whose ubiquity the IBM PC's adoption established as the default environment created the developer ecosystem whose application library created the user dependency, whose installed base created the developer ecosystem in the self-reinforcing cycle, whose momentum, the network effect's economic logic, compounds across the decades as the structural moat, whose depth, the alternative platform's capability must exceed before the switching costs calculation favors the departure over the continued tolerance of the incumbent platform's accumulating failures. Gates understood this dynamic better than anyone in the industry. What Gates did not fully anticipate, and what Microsoft's subsequent leadership has consistently underestimated as the structural threat, is the specific condition under which the moat's depth becomes insufficient to retain the user whose accumulated grievance has crossed the threshold that the switching costs barrier cannot hold as the effective retention mechanism. That threshold, for millions of users simultaneously, was crossed in the specific moment when Microsoft looked at 240 million functional computers and said, "Those computers are no longer our responsibility." The shock is not that users are leaving. The shock, from the perspective of the Microsoft leadership whose product decisions the departure's scale indicts as the miscalculation, is the destination to which the departing users are arriving as the chosen alternative. The expectation that the Windows exit produces the Mac adoption as the premium alternative's beneficiary, or the Chromebook adoption as the simplified alternative's recipient, has been confounded by the specific finding that the Linux distribution download statistics document as the directional evidence. The users who are leaving Windows are not primarily moving to the alternatives whose commercial infrastructure the corporate competitor provides as the supported ecosystem. They are moving to the operating system that nobody owns, that nobody sells, that no corporation controls. And that exists because thousands of developers across the global community contribute the work whose accumulation the Linux kernel's development history records as the collaborative achievement whose governance the community's distributed ownership ensures against the single corporation's interest, whose prioritization the proprietary alternatives decision history documents as the recurring pattern. Alternatives decision history documents as the recurring pattern. The gaming community's defection represents the specific loss whose strategic significance the Microsoft gaming investment's scale reveals as the recognized vulnerability requiring the defensive response. The gamer, whose Windows attachment the gaming library's compatibility requirement historically cemented as the platform dependency, so strong that the privacy concern, the advertising intrusion, and the forced updates workflow disruption together failed to overcome as the departure motivation sufficient to exceed the gaming library's retention power, discovered in the Steam Deck's mainstream arrival the proof that the retention powers foundation had been dissolved by the Proton compatibility layer's achievement without the dramatic announcement whose absence the gradual improvement's incremental character explains as the evolutionary rather than the revolutionary change, whose sudden revelation the single product's demonstration provided as the concrete evidence. The Steam Deck running the Windows gaming library on the Linux operating system without the compatibility catastrophe that the Windows gaming dependency's justification always cited as the Linux adoption's insurmountable barrier, communicated to the gaming population in the language that the technical argument never successfully delivered as the equivalent persuasion, the language of the working demonstration whose daily operation the user's own hands validate as the personal experience rather than the advocate's claimed capability. Valve understood something about the Windows dependency that Microsoft's gaming strategy consistently treated as the permanent structural advantage rather than the addressable technical problem whose solution the sufficient engineering investment could deliver as the competitive disruption. The gaming library, whose Windows exclusivity, the DirectX dependency, and the anti-cheat software's kernel-level Windows requirement created as the technical lock-in, was not the permanent moat that Microsoft's competitive analysis apparently characterized as the durable barrier. It was the solvable engineering challenge whose solution the DXVK translation layer, the Proton compatibility framework, and the SteamPlay integration together delivered as the systematic dissolution of the dependency, whose persistence Microsoft's gaming advantage depended on as the structural foundation. When Valve solved the problem that Microsoft assumed was unsolvable as the permanent retention mechanism, the gaming community's Linux adoption barrier dissolved with the dependency's technical foundation and the departure motivation that the privacy concern, the advertising intrusion, and the forced update had generated, as the accumulated grievance finally exceeded the switching cost threshold whose gaming library retention the Proton solution had simultaneously lowered as the departure's enabling condition. The enterprise dimension of the abandonment, whose consumer narrative's dominance the mainstream coverage perpetuates as the complete story, is the dimension whose scale embarrasses the Windows narrative more significantly than the consumer departure. Because the enterprise customer whose procurement decision, the total cost of ownership calculation, governs as the rational economic analysis rather than the emotional response to the personal affront, is the customer whose Linux adoption represents not the frustrated individual's principled stand, but the financial institutions, the government agencies, and the global corporation's deliberate conclusion that the Microsoft licensing cost, the vendor dependency's strategic risk, and the data sovereignty concern whose European regulatory environment elevates as the compliance requirement together produce the migration business case, whose return on investment to the Linux alternative's zero licensing cost delivers as the immediate financial justification whose approval the Budget Committee's economic rationality provides as the straightforward calculation. Germany's government, whose public sector Linux deployment the press has covered across the years as the recurring story of the idealistic experiment's practical challenge and the practical challenge's eventual resolution, represents the template whose replication the European public sector's Microsoft dependency concern motivates as the sovereignty strategy, rather than the cost reduction's exclusive focus. The municipality that pays the Microsoft license fee for every government computer every year, with the mandatory upgrade cycle whose hardware requirement the Windows version's succession imposes, as the equipment refresh that the budget must accommodate as the recurring capital expenditure, compared against the Linux deployment whose license fee is zero, whose upgrade cycle the distribution's long-term support schedule extends as the 5-year or 10-year horizon without the hardware obsolescence that the Windows version's new system requirements creates as the artificial replacement pressure. This comparison produces the migration business case whose financial clarity the enterprise technology decision's rational evaluation cannot dismiss as the ideological preference whose practical inadequacy the implementation complexity reveals as the real cost. The real cost of the Linux migration exists and is significant. The real cost of the continued Windows dependency also exists, also is significant, and grows with each licensing cycle's fee increase whose negotiating position the monopoly platform's absence of the credible alternative historically strengthened as the price escalation's enabling condition that the Linux alternative's viability now undermines as the credible departure threat. The privacy regulatory environment whose European General Data Protection Regulation established as the compliance framework and whose subsequent global adoption, the data protection consciousness's political momentum continues as the expanding territorial scope, has created the specific legal risk dimension of the Windows telemetry, whose presence in the enterprise computing environment, the data protection officer's compliance assessment identifies as the risk, whose mitigation. The Windows telemetry's configuration management attempts as the incomplete solution. The operating system that collects behavioral data as the designed architecture, deployed in the enterprise environment whose employee personal data, the data protection regulation requires, as the protected information whose unauthorized transmission the compliance frameworks penalizes as the regulatory violation, creates the legal exposure whose resolution the Linux deployment's telemetry-free architecture delivers as the architectural remedy rather than the configuration workaround whose completeness the closed source system's opacity prevents from verifying as the confirmed absence rather than the configured suppression whose underlying collection, the proprietary system's unexaminable architecture, may continue as the unverifiable background operation. With the mandatory upgrade cycle whose hardware requirement the Windows version's succession imposes, as the equipment refresh that the budget must accommodate as the recurring capital expenditure, compared against the Linux deployment whose license fee is 0, whose upgrade cycle the distribution's long-term support schedule extends as the 5-year or 10-year horizon without the hardware obsolescence that the Windows version's new system requirements creates as the artificial replacement pressure. This comparison produces the migration business case whose financial clarity the enterprise technology decision's rational evaluation cannot dismiss as the ideological preference whose practical inadequacy the implementation complexity reveals as the real cost. The real cost of the Linux migration exists and is significant. The real cost of the continued Windows dependency also exists, also is significant, and grows with each licensing cycle's fee increase whose negotiating position the monopoly platform's absence of the credible alternative historically strengthened as the price escalation's enabling condition that the Linux alternative's viability now undermines as the credible departure threat. The privacy regulatory environment whose European General Data Protection Regulation established as the compliance framework and whose subsequent global adoption, the data protection consciousness's political momentum continues as the expanding territorial scope, has created the specific legal risk dimension of the Windows telemetry, whose presence in the enterprise computing environment, the data protection officer's compliance assessment identifies as the risk, whose mitigation. The Windows telemetry's configuration management attempts as the incomplete solution. The operating system that collects behavioral data as the designed architecture, deployed in the enterprise environment whose employee personal data, the data protection regulation requires, as the protected information whose unauthorized transmission the compliance frameworks penalizes as the regulatory violation, creates the legal exposure whose resolution the Linux deployment's telemetry-free architecture delivers as the architectural remedy rather than the configuration workaround whose completeness the closed source system's opacity prevents from verifying as the confirmed absence rather than the configured suppression whose underlying collection, the proprietary system's unexaminable architecture, may continue as the unverifiable background operation. What Bill Gates built was extraordinary. The democratization of personal computing, whose achievement the Windows platform's ubiquitous deployment enabled as the accessible technology, whose user population's global expansion, the affordable PC's mass production, and the Windows operating system's familiar interface together, facilitated, as the computing literacy's foundational infrastructure, represents the genuine historical contribution whose significance the Exodus's current acceleration does not diminish as the retrospective reassessment. What Gates built was the right thing for the era whose requirements the proprietary platform's centralized development satisfied, as the quality and consistency standard whose open source alternatives' distributed development model could not yet match as the equivalent capability. The era has changed. The open source model's maturation has delivered the quality and consistency whose absence historically justified the proprietary alternative's premium. The platform whose monopoly the era's requirements once validated as the necessary infrastructure has become the platform whose monopoly the accumulated decisions user cost validates as the unnecessary imposition whose tolerance the capable alternative's existence no longer requires as the unavoidable condition. The shock is real, not because Microsoft is collapsing, Microsoft's cloud business, whose Azure revenue the enterprise computing's cloud migration funds as the growth engine, is thriving as the separate success story whose Windows desktops decline the diversified business model absorbs as the managed transition rather than the existential crisis. The shock is real because the assumption that the Windows desktop's monopoly was permanent, that the switching cost was prohibitive, that the gaming dependency was unbreakable, that the application ecosystem was irreplaceable, and that the Linux alternative was perpetually almost ready but never actually ready. Every one of these assumptions has been simultaneously invalidated by the specific developments whose combination the current moment represents as the convergence that the monopoly's permanence assumption did not survive as the predictive framework. The shock is the recognition that the permanent thing was not permanent, that the unbreakable dependency was broken, that the insurmountable barrier was surmounted, and that the millions of users whose decision that the collective departure's scale transforms into the industry-defining movement whose momentum, the quarterly earnings, calls Windows revenue line, will continue registering as the declining contribution, whose trajectory the enterprise cloud's growth partially obscures but cannot permanently conceal as the foundational shift in the relationship between the world's computer users and the operating system that governed that relationship, as the default assumption for longer than the internet has existed as the daily infrastructure. Millions have already left. Millions more are leaving right now, today, as the Windows 10 deadline's reality replaces the theoretical consideration with the practical urgency whose resolution the Linux installation provides as the immediately available answer to the question that Microsoft's hardware abandonment forced as the unavoidable decision. The distribution download servers are registering the departures as the incoming connections whose volume the community's infrastructure scales to accommodate as the growing demand. The forum communities are welcoming the arrivals as the new members whose Windows background the migration questions reveal, as the common origin story whose frequency the current moment's distinctive character establishes as the statistical pattern rather than the individual narrative. The Linux ecosystem is receiving the exodus's momentum as the adoption acceleration, whose compounding effect the network's growth produces as the expanding community, the improving software, the growing hardware support, and the increasing developer investment together constitute as the virtuous cycle, whose rotation the departure's scale has accelerated beyond the threshold that the previous Linux growth trajectory's extrapolation would have predicted as the distant future. The future is not distant. The exodus is not predicted. The abandonment is not coming. It is here, it is documented, it is accelerating, and the man who called Linux a cancer is watching the cure become the operating system of choice for millions of people who simply decided they deserved a computer that works for them instead of against them. That is the real shock. And that shock has no recovery.